a new flight was inaugurated. It was called Flight 1000.
There was a time when flying across oceans meant one name: Pan American World Airways. Before global travel became routine, before budget airlines and crowded terminals, Pan Am represented something larger than transportation. It represented American reach. When a Pan Am aircraft landed in a foreign capital, it felt like the arrival of a nation. The company began in 1927, created initially to carry mail between Key West, Florida, and Havana, Cuba. What started as a small operation quickly became a strategic tool of American expansion. The US government saw aviation as a way to project influence across Latin America, and Pan Am became its unofficial ambassador in the sky. Under the leadership of Juan Trippi, Pan Am did not think small. Trippi believed air travel would shrink the planet, and he wanted Pan Am to own the routes that mattered. During the 1930s, while many airlines focused domestically, Pan Am built international networks. It pioneered long-distance flying boats that crossed oceans before reliable runways even existed. Destinations like Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Lisbon, and Hong Kong were connected under the Pan Am banner. These were not simple commercial flights. They were symbols of technological dominance. The Boeing 314 Clipper, introduced in 1939, could carry passengers across the Atlantic in comfort that resembled ocean liners. Dining tables, sleeping berths, attentive service. It was expensive, elite, and powerful. Flying Pan Am was an experience reserved for diplomats, executives, celebrities, and the wealthy. World War II elevated the airline further. Pan Am crews flew military routes, transported personnel, and supported strategic operations across multiple continents. When the war ended, the infrastructure and experience gained during conflict positioned Pan Am perfectly for the jet age. The 1950s and 1960s became its golden era. Pan Am was the first American airline to operate the Boeing 707 in 1958, ushering in the modern jet age. Travel times between New York and Paris were cut dramatically. International tourism surged. Business travel expanded. The world began to feel smaller. Pan Am was at the center of that transformation. By the mid-1960s, Pan Am served over 80 countries on 6 continents. No other airline matched its global footprint. Its blue globe logo became one of the most recognized corporate symbols on Earth. Airports across Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America carried the presence of American aviation through Pan Am counters and crew uniforms. The airline did not operate domestic U.S. routes for most of its early existence. It focused almost entirely on international prestige. That specialization reinforced its identity. In 1970, Pan Am became the launch customer for the Boeing 747. The jumbo jet transformed air travel. It carried more than twice the passengers of earlier jets, lowering ticket prices and making international travel accessible to middle-class families. The first 747 flight from New York to London symbolized the peak of American aviation confidence. Financially, the company appeared dominant. It generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue during an era when global aviation was still maturing. It employed tens of thousands of workers, from pilots and flight attendants to mechanics and international operations staff. Entire airport terminals were designed around Pan Am's traffic. Culturally, it defined glamour, uniformed crews stepping off wide-body jets, passengers dressed formally for long-haul flights, advertising campaigns that promised sophistication and global connection. To work for Pan Am meant status. To fly Pan Am meant you had arrived. But beneath that prestige, structural weaknesses were forming. Pan Am depended heavily on international routes, which made it vulnerable to geopolitical instability. It had no strong domestic feeder network inside the United States. Competitors like TWA and American Airlines operated profitable domestic systems that funneled passengers into international routes. Pan Am relied on partnerships and purchased capacity instead of owning that pipeline. The 747 purchase, though visionary, also carried enormous financial risk. The aircraft required high passenger loads to remain profitable. If global travel slowed, the fixed costs would remain. For a while, growth covered those risks. Demand kept rising. Oil was affordable. International travel expanded year after year. confidence masked fragility. Pan Am looked untouchable at the dawn of the 1970s. In 1968 alone, the airline carried more than 11 million passengers, an extraordinary figure for an era when international flying was still considered special rather than routine. Its transatlantic routes between New York, London, Paris, and Frankfurt were among the busiest long-haul corridors in the world. Corporate contracts, diplomatic travel, and tourism all flowed through its network. Governments often negotiated landing rights directly with Pan Am executives because the airline effectively represented American aviation abroad. The company also invested heavily in infrastructure beyond aircraft. It operated its own training academies, maintenance bases, and overseas offices staffed by multilingual personnel. Pan Am pilots were among the most experienced in long-haul navigation, and its flight attendants were trained not just in service, but in representing American professionalism overseas. The brand was carefully managed because it functioned as a projection of national identity. Revenue during the late 1960s climbed steadily, and expansion plans assumed continued growth in global travel demand. Aircraft orders were placed years in advance, locking the company into long-term financial commitments. Debt levels rose to support fleet modernization, but confidence in passenger growth made those obligations appear manageable. Few executives believed international traffic could reverse in any meaningful way. Yet the very scale that made Pan Am impressive also made it rigid. Large aircraft required consistently high occupancy. International operations depended on stable currency markets and cooperative foreign governments. Unlike airlines with strong domestic backbones, Pan Am had limited ability to shift capacity internally if international demand softened. Its identity was tied almost entirely to global routes, and that focus left little room for flexibility. The world was about to change faster than Pan Am expected. The turning point arrived in 1973, and it did not come from inside the airline industry. It came from oil. In October of that year, members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the United States and several Western nations. Fuel prices surged almost overnight. For airlines, fuel was not a minor expense. It was one of the largest operational costs, and the increase was immediate and severe. The economics of long-haul flying changed within months. Pan Am was particularly exposed. Its entire business model revolved around international routes that required enormous fuel consumption. The Boeing 747, which had symbolized expansion only a few years earlier, suddenly became expensive to operate. Each flight demanded high passenger loads just to break even. If demand dipped even slightly, losses mounted quickly. International travel slowed as global economies struggled with inflation and recession triggered by the oil shock. Corporate budgets tightened, tourism softened, the steady upward trajectory that executives had relied on for planning no longer existed. Unlike competitors with strong domestic networks, Pan Am could not easily offset international weakness with profitable short-haul routes inside the United States. For decades, the airline had avoided building a domestic system, believing its international dominance was sufficient. That strategic decision now limited flexibility. At the same time, regulatory change was reshaping the American airline industry. In 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act removed government control over fares and route assignments. For established carriers, deregulation introduced aggressive competition. New airlines entered markets, price wars intensified, and profit margins narrowed. Pan Am entered deregulation without a solid domestic feeder network. To compete effectively in the new environment, it needed passengers from U.S. cities to fill its international flights. Instead of gradually building domestic routes over decades, the airline made a dramatic move. In 1980, Pan Am purchased National Airlines for $437 million. The acquisition was intended to give Pan Am a domestic presence and access to valuable routes, particularly in Florida and along the East Coast. On paper, the deal appeared strategic. In practice, it was deeply problematic. National Airlines came with its own corporate culture, labor agreements, and operational systems. Integrating the two companies proved difficult and expensive. Labor disputes intensified. Fleet differences increased maintenance complexity. Expected synergies were slower to materialize than projected. Worse, Pan Am financed the acquisition with significant debt at a time when interest rates were high and fuel prices remained volatile. The purchase strained the balance sheet precisely when financial flexibility was most needed. Competition intensified throughout the early 1980s. Airlines like American, United, and Delta leveraged strong domestic networks to dominate key markets. They could feed international flights efficiently, adjust pricing quickly, and shift aircraft between routes to manage demand. Pan Am, still heavily weighted toward international prestige, struggled to adapt. Operational costs remained high. The airline maintained a global infrastructure designed for dominance rather than survival. Overseas offices, large crews, and wide-body fleets were expensive commitments in an increasingly price-sensitive market. Then came another shock. In December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people. The bombing was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. Beyond the immediate tragedy, the event severely damaged Pan Am's reputation. Security concerns intensified across the industry, but Pan Am bore the symbolic weight of the attack. Passenger confidence declined, legal costs mounted, insurance premiums rose, governments scrutinized security practices. For an airline already weakened by financial strain, the disaster compounded instability. By the late 1980s, Pan Am was selling assets to stay afloat. It sold its Pacific routes to United Airlines in 1985. Later, it sold its profitable London Heathrow routes to United for $290 million, sacrificing some of its most valuable international gateways to generate cash. Each sale reduced the airline's global footprint. What had once been the world's most expansive international network began shrinking piece by piece. Revenue opportunities narrowed, even as debt obligations remained. Pan Am's identity had been built on scale and prestige. As routes disappeared, that identity eroded. The airline that once connected 6 continents was retreating to survive. The pressures were no longer temporary. They were structural. Rising fuel costs, deregulated competition, debt from acquisitions, and reputational damage formed a combination that prestige alone could not overcome. By the end of the 1980s, Pan Am was no longer the symbol of American aviation power. It was an airline fighting for liquidity, selling off its future to pay for its past. By the early 1990s, Pan Am was no longer collapsing in slow motion. It was running out of time. The asset sales of the late 1980s had kept the airline alive, but they had also stripped it of the very routes that once generated dependable revenue. Selling the Pacific network and later the prized Heathrow slots brought in cash, yet it reduced Pan Am's ability to compete globally. The airline that had defined international travel was now operating a fragmented system with shrinking influence. In 1990, another external shock hit. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait triggered the Gulf War, sending oil prices upward again and depressing international travel. Long-haul demand weakened, just as Pan Am was attempting to stabilize its operations. The company did not have the financial strength to absorb another fuel spike or a prolonged decline in passenger traffic. Losses accelerated. Cash reserves thinned. Creditors grew cautious. Suppliers demanded tighter payment terms. Every week required negotiations to keep aircraft flying. In 1991, Pan Am entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the second time. Management sought buyers and investors who might salvage parts of the company. Delta Airlines agreed to purchase key assets and invest in a reorganized version of Pan Am, including control of its transatlantic routes and a stake in operations centered around New York. For a brief moment, it appeared that Pan Am might survive in reduced form. Flights continued, tickets were sold, crews reported for duty wearing uniforms that once symbolized the height of aviation glamour. But the restructuring plan depended heavily on fresh capital and stable bookings, neither of which materialized at the necessary scale. Delta ultimately withdrew further financial support after concluding that continued losses were unsustainable. Without that backing, Pan Am's remaining operations could not continue independently. On December 4, 1991, Pan Am operated its final scheduled flight. Pan Am Flight 436 departed from Bridgetown, Barbados, and landed at Miami International Airport. There was no dramatic announcement in the sky, no ceremony marking the end of an era. The aircraft touched down, taxied to the gate, and the airline that once connected 6 continents ceased operations. More than 7,500 employees lost their jobs as the company shut down. Aircraft were reassigned or sold. Logos were removed from terminals. Within days, competitors absorbed routes that Pan Am had pioneered decades earlier. The collapse was not caused by a single mistake. It was the result of accumulated pressures: heavy debt from expansion, vulnerability to fuel volatility, failure to build a durable domestic feeder system, deregulated price competition, and the reputational damage following Lockerbie. Each factor alone might have been survivable. Together, they proved fatal. Pan Am's fall carried symbolic weight beyond aviation. For much of the 20th century, the airline had represented American global presence. It transported diplomats, executives, soldiers, and tourists during moments of both prosperity and conflict. Its aircraft were often the first American presence in newly opened international airports. When it disappeared, it signaled more than the bankruptcy of a corporation. It reflected the shift of global aviation power toward diversified carriers with balanced domestic and international systems. Airlines such as Delta, United, and American expanded internationally while retaining strong domestic networks that stabilized revenue during downturns. The industry Pan Am helped create continued growing, but without the company that once defined it. Today, Pan Am survives mostly as a brand licensed for memorabilia and nostalgia. The blue globe logo appears on bags and retro merchandise, reminders of a period when international travel felt rare and elevated. Former employees still gather at reunions, sharing stories of distant destinations and long-haul flights that once felt historic. Looking back, Pan Am's rise and fall reveal a pattern common in large enterprises built during periods of rapid expansion. Dominance in one era does not guarantee resilience in the next. Strategic choices made during prosperity can become liabilities when conditions change. Pan Am built the architecture of global air travel. It pioneered routes, introduced aircraft that transformed passenger capacity, and defined the image of international aviation for generations. Yet it entered the era of deregulation and volatile energy markets without the structural flexibility needed to survive. Its final years were not marked by scandal alone, or by a sudden collapse, but by gradual contraction under mounting financial strain. Prestige could not compensate for leverage. Brand recognition could not replace liquidity. History could not protect against shifting economics. When Pan Am's last flight landed in Miami, it closed a chapter that had begun in 1927 with a single mail route to Havana. In between those dates lay the story of an airline that once carried the image of a country across oceans and discovered that scale without adaptability can turn strength into fragility.